The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Welcome to the bonus show. The topic of profits from Donald Trump's hotels and the idea that Trump is profiting from the presidency, possibly illegally, possibly in violation of the Constitution's Emoluments Clause, has been a pretty big topic of discussion. And in fact, when the topic of impeachment even comes up, there are lots of people who say there is a case for impeaching Donald Trump, but it should be along the lines of financial corruption, Emoluments Clause violations, and sometimes the topic of Yemen is mentioned rather than Russian collusion or obstruction. And unfortunately, Donald Trump has scored a pretty significant legal victory here because a three-judge panel in the Fourth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals overturned a lower ruling by a federal judge, which said that a lawsuit against Donald Trump for profiting from the presidency via his hotels could move forward. The three-judge panel now says it cannot move forward. And the argument is that there is simply not standing to pursue the claims against Trump. So this is really important to understand, Pat. There are lots of cases that fall apart, not on the merits, but because of issues of standing or jurisdiction. And very often, because people are busy, they just hear that the case isn't moving forward, and they get the impression that it was determined that there is no merit to it, when in reality, these are more procedural issues. It relates to whether the people bringing the case have standing to do so. That doesn't tell us anything about the merits. And in fact, I think the merits continue to be relatively strong. It's a question of whether they will ever be able to actually be adjudicated properly. And if you don't get the right standing in jurisdictional circumstances, you're simply not going to be able to do it. That's all that has happened here.
Yeah, and it still is unfortunate, though, because the optics are that Trump isn't profiting off of the presidency, that he isn't breaking the Emoluments Clause. And that's too bad. I used to think that when it came to impeaching Donald Trump, this is one of the most clear-cut accusations you can throw at him,
yes,
the Emoluments Clause, whereas the Russia stuff, that's a little bit more up in the air. The Stormy Daniels campaign finance violation, I think that's pretty clear, but maybe too salacious to really get people's attention around.
Or simply not impeachable.
The campaign finance violation?
I mean, arguably, so there's a question of when campaign finance violations rise to the level of justifying impeachment.
Yeah, and of course the Constitution just says that you can impeach a president over treason, bribery, other high crimes and misdemeanors. So It's a little vague in a sense. But I always thought that the Emoluments Clause was a clear-cut case. I remember a while back people levied this charge against him, and Trump made like a one-time payment to reimburse. I don't even know who it would have been. The taxpayer, I suppose, for the money that he was making off of his hotels in Washington, D.C. But I think that he ultimately just stopped doing that, and now he just continues to get away with it.
Yeah, I don't even remember that. To me, that's during his presidency. I have like just a tinge of recollection, but I don't really remember the details of that.
Yeah, I remember Sean Spicer making a big thing out of it. It was around the same time that they were making a big thing out of Donald Trump donating his presidential salary.
Yeah.
Which he always goes back to. This is the type of thing he tries to push, that he's not profiting off the presidency. And in fact, he's even donating his salary of $400,000 a year, giving it to charity, giving it to different government agencies. And this is just some great philanthropic guy that we should all be proud of.
There's this sort of contradiction between, there are so many right-wingers who say that they want to limit the power of government, they want to limit the power of the presidency, and they want to put power back elsewhere, usually with the people, if not with states or whoever else. But at the same time, they want it to be really, 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 really difficult to impeach the president of the United States, at least when it's someone that they like. And this is one of those things that we just have to understand. I mean, the quickest way to remove Trump is by voting him out in November of 2020. I think most of our audience, especially the bonus show audience, understands that. But part of the reason why this is so difficult is because there is so much power from incumbency, from being the president, and so many exceptions to the rule that even senators and members of Congress aren't privileged by, that the president is when it comes to protecting themselves from consequences to their actions. And if conservatives really wanted to take power away from the presidency, one of the things is it should be actually easier to impeach a president. I'm not saying it should be easy, but it should be easier.
But of course, when a Republican stands on principle, like Justin Amash did from Michigan, he has to leave the party. They decide to take him off his committee assignments, and he has no shot of going anywhere with his political future. So the repercussions are serious, and they're, of course, not going to do that knowing it.
You're not allowed in the club anymore once you actually say, hey, wait a second, we have principles we talk about and we're not living by them. It's like, yes, that is actually a lot of politics, left and right, but particularly on some issues, it's particularly noticeable in the Republican Party. Hey, this is a crazy thing. There was a family that got involved in a brawl at Disneyland, and they are now going to potentially be facing charges because law enforcement sources have sent the investigation over to prosecutors for possible charges. And the police department, of course, collects information and collects evidence, and then they present it to prosecutors who will decide, are we going to file charges in this crazy situation? This happened Saturday night. Disneyland has a section called Toontown, which just sounds so fun. I can't imagine how fun that would be. And according to witnesses, an argument started between family members, and then the family actually got involved in a brawl, and it was filmed. There are pictures. No arrests were initially made. The video went viral online, and now there's a whole bunch of video evidence as to who did what. Two men are initially in an altercation. It spirals out of control. Women end up getting punched and spit on. One of the men is choked out by another man. I mean, it's just absolute and total chaos, Pat. And now there may actually be charges for an intra-family brawl. I mean, how insane is what's going on here?
The video is crazy. I honestly enjoyed every minute of it, even though I feel guilty to some extent, taking pleasure out of it because it seems like this family really does have some problems.
Yeah.
Especially if they're hitting each other, that we never want to see. But just the idea that they're in Toontown, Disneyland, and you see people dressed up in costumes walking around, and there's like dozens of people watching the fight, but no one initially gets involved in breaking them up, even though there's plenty of opportunities to do so.
Yeah.
The terrible fighting technique, like it was all just very, very hilarious to me. And the fact that initially no one had charges pressed against them, I suppose because they didn't know the reason for the altercation. The family wasn't willing to provide the reason for the altercation, and initially didn't have that video evidence. There weren't any charges at first.
Well, and the other thing
that added
to that
a whole layer of fascination.
There also weren't charges because everybody was cooperative, and nobody indicated that they were particularly interested in pressing charges. And depending on the state and depending on the crimes, there can be sort of prosecutorial discretion in terms of, does the prosecutor unilaterally decide about charges, or do they consider what the victims of the crime want? Of course, when you have a fight in which tons of people are involved, victims and perpetrators become sort of blurred. What this says to me is that my feeling of being against these amusement parks is completely justified and warranted. It brings out the worst in people, having to wait 2 hours to get on some stupid ride and paying $13 for a cheap hot dog. This brings out the worst in people, and that's what I am sort of resting my opinion on, that it's just absolutely horrible at these places.
Yeah, I honestly didn't even know what else to say about the story until you brought up that point. Like I mentioned to the bonus show audience that a few weeks ago I went to Six Flags. I told the Jacob Slatter story. But the entire day I was just totally unimpressed with humanity.
Yes.
Walking around, seeing people just overconsume, people getting angry for the strangest reasons. Like, angry with the people working at the park, angry with other people who are trying to enjoy the park. It was all just gross to me for the most part, and I'm going to limit my Six Flags visits to once every 3 years just because of that.
Yeah, I think the last time, so I went to Disney World when I was 18, but it was because I went down to Orlando because of a trip I won for being a top salesperson at Circuit City, hilariously enough. I never would have chosen to go there at age 18. And then I think I went to Six Flags in Agawam, Massachusetts, maybe when I was like 19 for the last time. I just don't like it. And is there even vegan food at Six Flags? Is there anything available?
Believe it or not, in this new age, there is. I was able to get a black bean burger, and it only cost me like $16, which is incredible.
Well, what's funny about that is, in Boston, there's plenty of $16 veggie burgers, and it wouldn't even really, like, nobody would even bat an eyelash because it's so common at any place that's remotely trendy. But I'm sure that the $16 burger that Six Flags is serving is probably not the same as the $16 one you'd get at like a hipster cafe.
It wasn't very gourmet.
Yeah.
And I don't even think it came with fries. It was certainly a ripoff, but it was a ripoff that I knew would happen going into it.
Sure.
So I wasn't too upset about it.
Fair enough. All right, let's get to Pete Buttigieg's Douglas Plan, which is meant to deal with racial inequality. Pete Buttigieg Listen, he's not Elizabeth Warren in terms of the specificity and depth of his plans, I think we would all admit. But every once in a while, he puts out something that tells us what he would actually do rather than just platitudes. And this is a plan which would establish a $10 billion fund for Black entrepreneurs over 5 years. It would invest $25 billion in historically Black colleges. It would legalize marijuana. It would expunge past drug convictions, reduce the prison population by 50%, and pass a new Voting Rights Act to further empower the federal government to ensure voting access. So I love a lot of this stuff, particularly because a lot of these are just issues that we should solve as a society. They will disproportionately benefit those who are marginalized or disaffected by these issues, like voting rights with minority individuals, not just Black Americans, but Latino as well and others. I think that some of these elements are a little bit not pie in the sky, but again, if you say we're going to throw 10 billion at Black entrepreneurs, who counts as Black? What business categories count? What's the process for application? How much goes to each individual? I mean, I'm not saying he needs to know all of these things by now. I'm just saying a lot of times these things don't go anywhere because those details are never actually fleshed out.
Yeah, especially when you talk about reparations, right? And I think that's why many candidates now are talking about how they support a commission to look into reparations.
Yes.
But none so far have come out and said, except for Marianne Williamson, of course,
yes,
that we should have reparations for Black people in America. And it's because the details do get very, very complicated.
Yes.
But Buttigieg wants to take a look at it. Bernie Sanders does too. Julian Castro. And yeah, no, we can definitely have that commission. I think that's totally fine. I wonder if this will raise Buttigieg's name in the polls amongst African-American voters, because right now he's barely registering.
Yes.
Like he may get 1 or 2%, but it's still Biden at the top. And then Bernie, number 2, Kamala Harris, after her recent debate performance, has surged into 3rd place among African-American voters.
Yeah. And there's also a question as to whether, I mean, okay, we can talk about the morality and the ethics of this. There's also a question as to whether slightly increasing his standing with Black American voters will actually do much for Pete Buttigieg, because South Carolina, sort of famously the first primary in which the Black Democratic vote really matters. In Iowa and New Hampshire, which are the first two, it's significantly less important. And so that's also another question. I'm not saying he's doing this for strategy. If he were, it's unclear to me how great of a strategy it is, because he's going to have to do something in Iowa and New Hampshire, even to justify staying in the race. Yeah,
for sure. He has to do really well in Iowa, New Hampshire. The South, he doesn't necessarily have to win those states, but I think he should expect to do well enough that he can pick up some delegates from those states, and that's why he really has to make the push. And it seems like once we get to the general election, maybe appealing to Southern African Americans, honestly, because of the electoral college system that we have, becomes less important for Democrats, because those states are going to vote Republican anyway. And that's just the unfortunate truth of it.
Something I don't actually remember offhand, Pat, is I know that in Iowa and in some other states, if you don't get 15% in the primary, you get 0 delegates. There's this vesting limit where if you don't get 15%, you get 0. Is that the case in all primaries? Because one person emailed me and said, in no primary do you get any delegates unless you get 15%. Now, mathematically, in states that are smaller, that have relatively fewer delegates, you would end up with 0 merely because like 5% would be closer to 0 than it would be to 1. But I don't actually remember offhand if that's the case for all states.
I was under the impression that some states are winner take all, some proportion. Some maybe have that 15% limit where under 15% you don't get any, but above that you get proportion delegates. Yes. That's what I thought it was, and I never thought that made too much sense, because if some states are doing it one way and other states are doing it other ways, that's going to skew the delegate counts at the end. It's possible, too, that maybe this time around the Democratic National Committee made some changes to how delegates are proportioned because of the disaster that was 2016.
What I remember is that it was not historically always this 15% limit, but it's possible that the people that are emailing me are just more up to date than I am, and these are changes. We're going to get it all figured out. Don't worry about it. It's not something that has yet come up beyond discussions of Iowa. But yeah, we should really have a uniform system, because as you're pointing out, having this patchwork, I mean, listen, there's many other ways in which we have patchwork systems in the United States, and that's not really a new thing when you have this sort of tension between federal supremacy and states' rights that takes place. But at least when it comes to how delegates are apportioned, I would like to see the exact same system in every state. And at least according to one person who emailed me, that is now the system we have. Although people might be shocked by this. Sometimes people email me and they assert things that aren't true. And that's always something that I have to, shocking, I know, but it is something that I have to always keep in mind. Okay, that does it for today. New show and bonus show tomorrow, and then a whole new week of shows coming up next week.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.